Okay, understood. Yeah.
Distinguished guests and honorable speakers, in the name of Dean Andrzej Stelmach, I would like to welcome you in the opening session of the second edition of the International Conference, Taiwan in Regional and International Relations. The conference is organized within the grant in cooperation with the Faculty of Political Science and Journalism and the Faculty of Neophilology with Professor Norbert Kordek and Professor Piotr Wierzchoń. I would like to express my gratitude for help and assistance, particularly to Matel Su and also others who helped very significantly and contributed. Diplomat Maciej Gaca from Nicholas Copernicus University, Torun. And also I would like to express my gratitude for co-organizers, Professor Przemysław Osiewicz, Dr. Rafał Wiśniewski, and Honorable Tomasz A. Szymczyński. I would like to also welcome our guests who are here with us, Professor Yuichi Hosoya, who came yesterday to Poznań, and is very particular moment that we are able to conduct this conference, organize this conference as a hybrid event here in person. We are also in Poznań. Also, I would like to thank the other speakers for accepting the invitation. And there are invited speakers from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and research centers in Poland who accepted the invitation. I would like to thank the other speakers for accepting the invitation as Stephen Nagy from International Christian University in Tokyo, Yu Hua Chen from Akita International University, Liang Ji Evans Chen from a Division of National Defense Strategy and Resources, Institute for National Defense and Security Research, Katie W. Chen from Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, Vice President, Christina Chen from the Institute for National Defense and Security Research, and also Sang-Chul Park from Korean Polytechnic University, and the Polish guest Ewa Trojnar from Jagiellonian University, Kraków, and also Łukasz Sarek, independent scholar who will join us later. Faculty of Political Science and Journalism will be represented by Professor Maciej Walkowski, Professor Beata Bochorodycz, Professor Przemysław Osiewicz, Professor Grażyna Strand, who is here with us. And also thank you for your contribution in organizing that conference. And Dr. Rafał Wiśniewski. I wish you fruitful deliberations, discussions, and interviewing questions. Moreover, the conference will give you the opportunity to submit an article to the distinguished strategic review listed in Scopus. So let's start. I would like to pass the voice to our moderator and also co-organizer, Tomasz, Professor Tomasz A. Szymczyński.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for such a great honor to be able to represent Mickiewicz University, Faculty of Political Science and Journalism on this very sunny day that we will concentrate on Taiwanese perspective towards international and regional relations. It's, of course, always the challenge of time. We have so many so interesting guests. So let me apologize that I will not continue too long this introduction, but just go directly into introducing our first guests. So on the panel first, which is called Japan and Taiwan Towards Increased Cooperation, the first of our speakers will be Honorable Professor Yuichi Hosoya from Faculty of Law from Keio University. After him, it will be Professor Stephen Nagy from International Christian University in Tokyo. And then the third person would be Ambassador Professor Maciej Gaca from Nicolaus Copernicus University from Toruń. And after Professor Maciej Gaca, there will be Professor Beata Bochorodycz from Mickiewicz University, who is actually right now in Japan. So we'll also be very interesting in hearing this perspective. Without further ado, I would wish to pass the scene towards Professor Yuichi Hosoya.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your very kind introduction. It seems that my own international connection is not so stable, so that's why I will talk in front of the microphone in this room. And I'm very glad to be with both Stephen and Beata. Both of them are my friends, and they are leading experts on Japanese foreign policy, well-known expert on Japanese foreign policy. So I'm very glad to be with them. And I will focus on Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, how Japan is trying to place Taiwan in Japan's own Indo-Pacific strategy. And I'd like to use my PowerPoint slide. Can you share my PowerPoint slide, please? Oh, yes, Taiwan in Japan. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. Yes. Thank you very much. I feel that Taiwan, the topic of Taiwan is now extremely timely because many people in the world are talking about Taiwan, not because of its own importance, but because of the importance to global politics. It means that everybody is now thinking about the possibility of a war in Taiwan because of the China's invasion to Taiwan. I thank you very much indeed. Maybe I can use this. And well, move to the next slide. One of the important point is that the link between what happening in Ukraine and what will happen in Taiwan, because there are many analogies between Russian invasion to Ukraine and also possible China's invasion to Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan is, well, according to Chinese explanation, a part of China, of course, based upon its own one China policy. And China doesn't regard Taiwan as a foreign country. Taiwan regards Taiwan as a part of course, China. So that's why it's an internal affairs for Beijing. So that's why China is repeatedly saying that China can do anything China wants regarding with Taiwan. So it's a matter of Chinese domestic policy for that China would try to use its military force to integrate Taiwan into a single political entity. So, well, the question is whether it is more probable for China to invade Taiwan or less probable to invade Taiwan, having seen the developments in Ukraine. This is one of the biggest questions. So that's why I think that the next target of international politics will be undoubtedly Taiwan. And in Japan and in Asia, we are discussing that there is less probability that China is trying to use military force to integrate Taiwan, but still there is a high probability that China is willing to use its own military force to integrate Taiwan. It depends on the attitude of both Taiwan and the United States, according to Beijing, whether China needs to use its military power. But I will talk about it later a bit more. And then another important thing is that Taiwan is located at a strategically important place in East Asian geopolitics. It is essential for China's People Liberation Army's Navy plan to freely penetrate into the Pacific Ocean from both East China Sea and the South China Sea. Therefore, China needs to control the islands of Taiwan strategically. It means that China really wants is a kind of a MAD, a mutual assured destruction, to have a reliable second strike capability. But China does not have reliable second strike capability. To do that, it is necessary for China to dispatch its own nuclear submarines deep into the Pacific Ocean. To go to the deep into the Pacific Ocean, it is necessary for China or Chinese People's Revolutionary Navy to go through the both East China Sea and South China Sea. So both East China Sea and South China Sea must be China's lake, a kind of Chinese owned property. But still, of course, the United States is controlling a majority, large part of East China Sea because of Okinawa, because of Taiwan. The two necessary objectives for China strategically is, first of all, to control effectively Taiwan for its own military purpose or for its own strategic purpose. The next target will be to make Okinawa as an independent entity, political entity, to separate Okinawa from the mainland Japan. So it is widely understood in Japan that China has been trying to support independence movement or separatist movement in Taiwan or in Okinawa to use Okinawa as an important tool for China strategically. So Okinawa and Taiwan are two important objectives for China to control the Pacific Ocean. So that's important. It is important for China to, first of all, fully integrate Taiwan into single political entity of China, strategically and politically, and in many ways otherwise. And secondly, I also want to talk that to symbolize Xi Jinping's political success, it is imperative for him, for Xi, to accomplish national unification between the mainland China and the Taiwan Islands at the time when economic growth is not as outstanding as before. So the first generation revolutionaries like Mao Zedong and so on, they could prove their importance, historical importance by showing their success in revolution. And then second generation leaders such as Deng Xiaoping, he could present his accomplishment by showing his success in economic growth. But actually Xi Jinping doesn't have anything to prove his place in history, China's history. It is really necessary for President Xi that Xi Jinping will be regarded as a leader who fully unify its own nation, I mean Chinese nation, without unifying Taiwan into mainland China. It means that Xi Jinping, President Xi, cannot prove anything in history of China in the as a great leader equal to only Mao Zedong. So to place President Xi in the Chinese history as a great leader, it is really necessary for Xi to unify Taiwan into a single entity. And thirdly, I also like to emphasize that Japan's role in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait becomes more important as Japan is regarded as the most favored or most trusted country by the Taiwanese. Now, Taiwanese people shows much less confidence in American engagement in Taiwan in contingency, partly because of American attitudes on Ukraine. Of course, the United States has been doing everything to help Ukrainian people short of directly engaging in a war. But it means that it would be probable that the United States military will not intervene in Taiwan as long as China is saying that China is willing to use the nuclear weapons. President Biden has been saying that he really needs to avoid nuclear war. It means that once China is showing its intention to use nuclear weapons, it means that the United States will face serious difficulty in helping Taiwanese, like what the United States is doing in Ukraine. This is a serious problem for Taiwanese people. That's why Taiwanese people is showing more willingness to rely on Japanese goodwill. But of course, Japan doesn't have many things to do to help Taiwanese strategically and militarily. So it has a serious problem as well. And lastly, I also like to focus on the importance that in the framework of the confrontation between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes, Taiwan is now being regarded as a symbol of a successful democratic regime in Asia. It means that both Ukraine and Taiwan should be regarded as a kind of a front line of the battle between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. If Ukraine will be defeated, and if Taiwan is controlled by authoritarian regime of China, it means that we are losing the battle between the two groups, liberal democratic camp and authoritarian regime camp. So we have to win the battle. To win the battle, we need to help both Ukraine and Taiwan because they are located at the front line of those battles. So let me show you a map of Taiwan in a much broader geopolitical landscape. The left-hand side is a map of the Taiwan in the Eurasian continent. You can see the kind of an enlargement of China's influence by seeing both the first island chain and the second island chain. China is expanding and trying to expand its sphere of influence by absorbing Taiwan and also Okinawa. In East China Sea and South China Sea, if China can control both Taiwan and Okinawa, it means that China can fully control the two seas, East China Sea and South China Sea. As long as China cannot control Okinawa and Taiwan, it means that the United States can move freely militarily around the area. So it is simply the matter for China to exclude American military influence from the region. Of course, China has been aware of the threat of American military engagement around the area. So to do that, it is really important for China to remove American military engagement around the area. To do that, it is essential for China to remove American bases in Okinawa and American commitments in Taiwan as well. And then, as I said before, Japan is now really trusted, the most trusted or most favorite country in Taiwan. Around 60% of Taiwanese people responded last year that they favor Japan the most. And only 5% of Taiwanese people answer that they favor China the most, and only 4% of them answer they favor the United States the most. And also, the question about to which country region Taiwan should be familiar with, 46% of Taiwanese people answer that they feel familiar with Japan in the region. So even though both United States and China are much more powerful than Japan, but still they feel that Japan is really important player in the region to maintain Taiwanese independence, to make the region more stable and prosperous. And then I like to mention about the Japanese position on that question. It means that Taiwan closed and the US-Japan alliance. And I quote from an recent article written by my colleague at Keio University, Professor Masaya Inoue. He wrote in his article that, quote, in February 1960, the Japanese government said that the security treaty covers the Far East, defined as an area including the Philippines and Northwest Japan and its surrounding areas, and the regions under the control of the South Korea and Taiwan. However, the security treaty, after it was revised in 1960, specialized that prior consultation with the Japanese government would be necessary if the United States wanted to use its military facility in Japan as basis for combat operations. Therefore, the US was unsure if the Japanese government in prior consultations would allow the United States forces in Japan to carry out attacks in the event of a contingency in Taiwan. The Taiwan clause in the November 1969 joint statement implied that even after the return of Okinawa from the US to Japan, the Japanese government would politically guarantee attacks by the US forces from Okinawa in case of a contingency in Taiwan, unquote. So this is a bit complicated matter. The reason why Japan is important for Taiwan is that at the time when the United States is trying to help Taiwan, of course, United States needs to use American bases in Okinawa or in Japan. Without using Japanese American bases in Japan, United States cannot exercise its military power. So it is imperative for the United States to use American bases in Japan, of course, but to use American bases in Japan, it is necessary for the United States to get Japanese acceptance. Without getting the Japanese acceptance, United States cannot use these military bases in Japan. So it means that without Japanese acceptance, United States cannot help Taiwan. And to ensure Japanese approval, there is a secret deal between Japanese government and the United States government. It means that based upon that Taiwan clause, United States can freely use American bases in Okinawa or in Japan at the time of contingency on Taiwan. So in other cases, the United States needs Japanese approval or Japanese acceptance. But on the case of Taiwan, United States has a kind of a free hand to use American military bases in Japan. But this is a kind of a secret deal. But anyway, it is essential for the US government to have a Japanese approval. So when Prime Minister Suga visited the United States last April last year, one of the biggest questions for the United States, the President Biden, was whether Japanese government under Prime Minister Suga could accept American usage of American military bases in Japan. And this was an essential thing. And in a secret tete-a-tete meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Suga, I suppose that the two leaders discussed on the Japanese approval on the usage of American bases in Japan at the time of the contingency in Taiwan, because around that time last year, many people talked about the possibility of war between Taiwan and China. And that in that opportunity, it was really necessary for the United States to ensure Japanese acceptance on the usage, American usage of military bases there. So this is a basic reason why Japan is essential for the United States or for Taiwan to secure the region. So Japan plays a very important role as a country which hosted and which hosts American bases there. And then I will talk a bit about Abe's Indo-Pacific strategy, but I think that I'm running out of time. Maybe I need to stop soon. How long, maybe?
Yeah, the thing is that we're discussing with Professor Beata and Professor Nagy that you have a little bit more time. So maybe it's still at least 5 minutes. And because we also are able to prolong the panel, we don't need to stop it exactly how it was planned on 11:15. So yeah. let's continue. At least 5 minutes, of course.
You're very kind, and I know that Stephen and Beata are really wonderful speakers. I'm really looking forward to.
It's actually initiative from their side that they wish you to speak a little bit more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I will talk a bit about Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, because Japan is a country which actually invented the concept of Indo-Pacific region. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe created several new concepts. One is an Indo-Pacific region, and the other one is Quad. Quad is also Shinzo Abe's creation as a strategic concept. The reason why Abe has been promoting Indo-Pacific strategy was to combine two oceans, Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, as a single entity. And according to Abe, Japan and the United States must be at the driving seat in the region, not China, because China has been promoting its own Belt and Road Initiative. But there are two important strategic concepts. One is Japan's Indo-Pacific Initiative, called Free and Open Indo-Pacific Region. We called it FOIP. And the other important strategic concept is China's Belt and Road Initiatives. There are two important strategic concepts. Interestingly, the United States didn't invent any concept. So it shows a kind of a slight decline of American influence there. Japan and China competing each other to promote each initiative. But on the other hand, the United States simply supported Japan's initiative. And in a strategic document of National Security Strategy of 2017, December, the United States government mentioned that the United States was willing to support Japan's initiative. Maybe for the first time after 1945, Japan has been in a driving seat, and the United States has been following Japanese initiative, not just in this kind of a strategic initiative, but at the same time, like a Japanese initiative on the CPTPP. United States is not a member of that. Instead, Japan played a leading role, of course, together with Canada, Australia, and other countries to create CPTPP without the United States. So it simply means that Japan has been playing a leading role in creating new initiatives in front of Chinese expanding influence. But the Japanese approach is slightly different from American approach, because Japanese government thought that it was essential to support China's BRI, because China is Japan's biggest trading partner. Without Chinese presence, Japan cannot prosper in the region. So Japan was trying to find a way to harmonize Japanese strategic initiative with Chinese initiative. So that's why, unlike the United States, Japanese government decided to support China's BRI. In July 2017, Japan said that Japan was willing to support BRI based upon several important conditions. But this is important, significant moment that Japan and China try to harmonize their own initiatives. But soon afterwards, December 2017, as I said, United States presented a different kind of initiative, strategic initiative, in its own strategic document. So American FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, is considerably different from Japanese approach, because American approach is much more confrontational to China. So that's why there are two different initiatives. And a new movement occurred in Taiwan in the election in 2016. DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, won the election, and President Tsai became a new president of Taiwan. And the Chinese government, Beijing, was really angry about the winning of DPP, because China favored Kuomintang much more, because Kuomintang was trying to be closer to Beijing. But on the other hand, it was seen from Beijing that Tsai or DPP was trying to be more independent from China. So this is one move. The other move was that the Trump administration was beginning to present a new initiative and much more confrontational to China. And in October 4th, 2018, Vice President Mike Pence showed a strategically important new vision on China. And it was regarded as the most important change of American policy towards China after 1971, Kissinger's visit to Beijing. So this was a strategically important new move. And Japan needed to adapt to these new trends of confrontation between the United States and China. And Suga and Kishida, a new prime ministers of Japan, began to show new moves on this regard. Japan needed to be closer to the United States in confronting to China. And also, Japan need to be aligned with other liberal democracies in an ideological confrontation between liberal democracy and authoritarian regimes. So this was a totally new move. And Taiwan was included in an important joint communique between Japan and the United States in last year's summit meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Suga. And it was said, I will soon end, it was said that we underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits and encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. So it means that Japanese government and the American government do not regard the issue of Taiwan Strait as an internal affair of China. It should be regarded as an international affairs in the region, which directly threaten Japanese peace and stability. And this trend moves. So Taiwan becomes furthermore important for Japanese policy because Taiwan, as I said in the beginning, is regarded as the front line between the battle or confrontation between the United States and China, also between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. And as I said in the beginning, that Japan should and can play a very important role in stabilizing the region by aligning with the United States and also by communicating with China to try to dissuade the Beijing government to use military power. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Hosoya. Very, very insightful. And of course, it's always in such circumstances, there is not enough time for presenting everything that we would wish, but I'm sure that was a great introduction and great panorama for next presentations. Next in our panel is Professor Stephen Nagy from International Christian University in Tokyo. Professor Nagy is with us here online, and his topic is Taiwan contingency and Japanese security, balancing strategic ambiguity, one China policy and supporting the status quo. So it's a continuation of this one China policy perspective. Professor Nagy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to speak on this topic. Thank you for the invitation. And again, following Professor Hosoya is always a very difficult task, but he's laid out on the table, I think, a wonderful way to understand Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think what's really, as a take-home message, I think, from his presentation is the distinct nature of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And I think that his discussion really bridges upon my discussion today that focuses on Japan's engagement with Taiwan and China through three lenses. The first lens is engagement. The second lens is resilience. And the third lens is deterrence. And I think these are very useful terms to understand how Japan is thinking about both Taiwan and China to secure peace and stability within the region. Just to start, and I think it's useful for us to think about Japan's trade in the region. Last year, despite a record unfavorable ratings with China, Japan traded about $210 billion in trade. Let me say that again, $210 billion. Japan is wedded to the Chinese market in terms of its economic future. Decoupling with China is not a possibility. And this leads to Japan crafting a policy for both Taiwan and China that, again, focuses on engagement, resilience, and deterrence. What are some examples of engagement? Well, simple examples, of course, of the regional comprehensive economic partnership in which Japan and China and South Korea, as well as the ASEAN countries, Australia and New Zealand, work together to produce a low-value trade agreement to build shared norms about trade, and of course, to embed China into a regional trade agreement. This continuation of a multilateral, multi-layered approach to engagement with China by the Japanese is something that is really critical for us to be thinking about how Japan is thinking about China. Secondly, we see ongoing negotiations between China, South Korea, and Japan on a trilateral free trade agreement. This again demonstrates Japan's engagement strategy with China. It's not a zero-sum approach, and I think this is really important take-home. And we even have Japan at least beginning the discussions about potentially including both Taiwan and China in the TPP-11. And again, I think this demonstrates Japan continue to engage with China. They understand the benefits of the relationship, but at the same time, they understand the risks. My assumption, once the COVID-19 pandemic is over and China opens up, we'll see increased cooperation on environmental, climate change, non-traditional security issues, and most likely education exchanges moving forward. So engagement is an important point in terms of understanding Japan's engagement with both Taiwan and China. The second is resilience. And here, I think geopolitical pressures, but also a non-traditional security events such as the COVID-19 pandemic has really impressed upon our Japan, the importance of building resilience into the Japanese economy. And this is usually falling under the umbrella of economic security, but we've seen Japan put together concrete initiatives such as the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative between India, Japan, and Australia to create alternative supply chains in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Japan is also working bilaterally with India. They've also worked with Australia and the United States in terms of a financing project. And of course, in 2020, the Japanese adopted a budget in which was emphasizing not only reshoring Japanese businesses from the region, but selectively diversifying supply chains throughout the region. This is a critical distinction between decoupling and diversification, is that Japan sees no future without selective diversification of supply chains. This means thinking about building alternative production networks in Southeast Asia and South Asia so that Japan is building and making products closer to centers of consumption. At the same time, they understand that the Chinese market of maybe 300, 400 middle-class Chinese consumers are going to be critical to Japan's sustainable economic future. And that means building in China, by Chinese, for Chinese, with Japanese technologies. Of course, this is where Taiwan comes in terms of building resilience, in particular resilience in technology supply chains. The Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company produces critical technologies that go into our iPhones, our computers, cars, and of course, jet fighters and other military tools. There's great concern about technology supply chains and the potential weaponization of these supply chains by China. And this is where a Taiwan contingency would be extremely troublesome for Japan and other countries. So building resilience into the supply chains is very critical for Japan, and we see it investing unilaterally, bilaterally, and multilaterally with like-minded countries to ensure that supply chains and trade remain stable. The vehicles of investment, of course, are the Quad, but also trade agreements like the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership. My last point, just to be brief and disciplined with time, is deterrence. Here, Japan is continuing to strengthen its relationship with the United States. The United States remains a cornerstone to Japan's security, but it's also diversifying. And we see this with that cake looks good, Professor Hosoya. We see Japan diversifying with the reciprocal access agreement with Australia. One was signed with the UK just 2 weeks ago, but I expect reciprocal access agreements to increase in number in the coming years as Japan sees these as important layers of deterrence within the region. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, although it is a security agreement, is also an agreement that focuses on technology working groups. Those technology working groups are meant to provide some deterrence in the areas of AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and hypersonic missiles. And we're going to see continued development in these particular areas through the Quad. But also I foresee that Japan will plug into the AUKUS agreement, not in the nuclear submarine part, but in terms of participating in AI, quantum computing, cybersecurity cooperation, and even perhaps hypersonic missiles. Other aspects of deterrence, I think is Japan's investment in multilateral and multi-layered engagement in the region and outside the region. Here, Japan's engagement with Europe through the Japan-Europe Economic Partnership Agreement is a very good example of that. linking Japan's interests to European interests really means that what happens to Japan, what happens in terms of Taiwan will matter to the European Union. That means that the European Union will need to engage within the region to help contribute to problem solving within the region. So in brief, I'd like to go back to my three main points. Useful tools to understand Japan's engagement in thinking about China and Taiwan are engagement, resilience, and deterrence. Japan does not have a zero-sum approach to China. It continues to use a one China policy to engage with both Taiwan and China. At the same time, it understands and is clearly articulating to both Taiwan and China that Japan supports the status quo. This is evidenced by Prime Minister Suga's visit with President Biden last year, where he explicitly stated that peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits is in Japan's interests. This was reiterated at the Quad meeting, at the G7 meeting, at the NATO meeting, and this will continue to be reiterated to the Chinese and the Taiwanese that Japan does not support unilateral independence by the Taiwanese, nor does it support forced reunification by Beijing. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagy, and it was, of course, very insightful, and we continue our journey with another specialist. Of course, we hope Professor Nagy is staying with us. We also see that Professor Beata Bochorodycz is also with us. We are very happy to see you, Beata. And right now, I would wish to pass the scene for Professor, Mr. Ambassador and Professor Maciej Gaca from representing Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń. And his presentation is going to be about Taiwan's national identity in the making. So, Professor Gaca, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Could you just turn on the presentation? Of this one, the green one, right? Good. Okay. Good. Thank you very much, and thank you indeed for this opportunity to participate in this very important conference. I understand that my presentation is not necessarily connected, directly with the Japanese and Taiwanese relation, although from the point of view of Taiwan, which is the subject here of our deliberations, it's quite important to understand what is their, Taiwanese people understanding of their identity. As in general, identity issue is the thriving debate all around the world currently. So when we talk about this Taiwanese national identity, we talk about a process that is in fact in making. It is very dynamic. In my presentation, I just want to go through history with some conclusion shortly. So what are the main reasons for the growth of a Taiwanese identity now, and is the growth of Taiwanese national identity inevitable in the years to come? The short answer for the second question is, of course, yes, but then we need to understand the background. Sorry, this one. Yeah, this is probably the best known resource of information about some preferences of people living in Taiwan concerning the understanding of with whom they identify with. It's run by the National Mickiewicz University since 1992, and you can see quite clearly here that what are the tendencies. So currently, as you know, more than 62% of Taiwanese consider themselves Taiwanese as only Taiwanese. And then with only 2.8% of people associating themselves as Chinese only, and 31.7% of them viewing themselves as Taiwanese and Chinese at the same time. As you can see, it's the process from 1992 till 2021, and the prospects, or let's say the tendency, is generally the same. The percentage of people who identify themselves being Taiwanese and Taiwanese only is growing constantly. There are many reasons for that, and these reasons we'll try to investigate with the help of further slides here. So go to the next one, please. And next one. Okay, so while 50 years ago, we talk of Japanese colonial rule, which was held in Taiwan for 50 years, 1895 to 1945, and it contributed to the development of distinct attitudes and distinct habits of Taiwanese people. But the arrival of the Kuomintang, of the nationalists from the mainland, or nationalist government, and its ill-disciplined soldiers from the mainland quickly disillusioned native Taiwanese. In what way? In that way that the trauma of February 28th incident, so-called Arba, when KMT military killed or slaughtered thousands of Taiwanese, left really harsh memories in the consciousness of native residents, and became the first, in my opinion, crucial marker on the development of Taiwanese identity. With the following years of the martial law, we could observe something surprising, that in the late 60s and beginning of 70s, a new approach emerged from the native Taiwanese people. What I mean by native, mostly people who inhabited the island with the Chinese origin, but for last 400 years. Well, the division is between the old immigrants from mainland China and the new ones who came to China in 49 and 90. Please, next one. So what was the KMT, or the nationalist government mistake, the way I see it, is that the KMT arrogated all forms of power to itself. They did not share any field of human or social or political activity with the islanders. Therefore, they implemented martial law, denied autonomy to any social organizations, made the Mandarin Chinese language obligatory in all social activity, and making this just national language, rendering society disorganized and powerless. And it was only late 1970s that non-KMT politicians emerged in Taiwan and began to call for self-determination, together with an explosion of social activism, addressing probably all or nearly every realm of life. So that's what happened in late 70s. So then the pressure on the opening of Taiwan was growing significantly. The next factor that influenced the building up of the national identity in Taiwan is the expansion of the private sector, which transfers substantial resources and social prestige to entrepreneurs. So now the entrepreneurs became a really important social group in Taiwan, and most of them were Taiwanese. So as a result of Taiwan's democratization processes, formally forbidden practice became debatable. So we see that from many aspects, the initiative here was not a political one in changing of the identity of Taiwanese people. It came from people, not from the government. Therefore, there were some other acts of terror from a KMT government. So Kaohsiung 1979 incident resulting from or resulting in a mass demonstration, and KMT crackdown of it. And it's another important marker of evolution of Taiwan's identity. And the most important thing that struck me during the analysis of the whole process is that Taiwan's democratization in 1986 has accelerated development of the inclusive identity on the island. So the inclusiveness, it's the word that we can use in terms of the most important driving engine of building up the national identity in Taiwan, even currently. just skip up some details and go into the most important names and figures and information here. I think we should go into the President Lee Teng-hui, who passed away 2 years ago. And under his leadership, new Taiwanese, Xin Taiwan Ren identity began to incorporate those residents coming from the mainland in the late 40s, as well as their heirs. So the process of integration and inclusiveness of everyone in Taiwan, that was the most important part of the Lee Teng-hui strategy. He said that the idea of the new era Taiwanese that he put forward in 2005, as was his memory from the time of being an active politician, it was very important because in 2020, there was the first handover of the power in Taiwan. And China then began to use a united front strategy to divide Taiwanese, aimed to boost national identification with Taiwan. So China changed its strategy, trying to divide Taiwanese, while the policy of Lee Teng-hui and his and the next president of Taiwan, which we will see in a couple of minutes, Chen Shui-bian, was to integrate people regardless their origin. In the idea of Lee Teng-hui, there was no distinction between new Taiwanese or old Taiwanese, regardless of the ethnicity. All 23 million people in Taiwan are new era Taiwanese. That's the statement that he brought first during his first term and then second term, and then he repeated it constantly up to his late years, up to 2020. So what's the legacy of Lee Teng-hui? I just give you the citation from one of his last remarks. Taiwan needs to resolve the issue of its divided national identity to become a full-fledged democracy, and that requires civic awareness and engagement from the public, as well as a humble national leader who is strongly committed to democracy. It's important because this remark from 2013 was like a path to open doors for a current president of Taiwan, Madame Tsai Ing-wen, because she exactly mirrors the statement that you can see here. So what we know is that general national identity includes both ethnic and civic aspects, and ethnic attachment is characterized by identification with the state's history, common myths and whatsoever. And it is happening. It's the fact, but the civic aspects are based on attachment to the state itself. And this attachment to the state is something what is growing constantly among Taiwanese citizens, including the youngest generation. So the next one in the course was the President Chen Shui-bian. We will not talk in details about his, let's say, all of his policies and all of his contribution. Some of them were not really welcomed due to some corruption issues and whatsoever. But in terms of the national identity, it's very important that national identity became almost a cure for all along his position as the president of Taiwan. Not only that he linked national identity with Taiwan's defense capabilities, but he associated it with the process of democratization. And since his time, whenever there was a new candidate for presidentship in Taiwan, the party, the Democratic Progressive Party, always brought up the issue of national identity to election campaigns, and what we can see currently with a great success. After 2 terms of Chen Shui-bian, there was President Ma Ying-jeou, and this is quite significant because he represented KMT, so the nationalists. What is striking is that in his early political career, 10 years before he gained the goal of being a president of Taiwan, he started his career becoming mayor of Taipei. It's a quite common thing that mayors of Taipei, after their terms being mayors, are candidates for the presidentship of whole Republic of China. And mind you, in 1998, he declared that he is a Xin Taiwan. So somehow he put himself into the path created by President Li Tenghui. He tried to attract people with a not very KMT approach. But just a year later, he reverted his understanding of who is he and what he wants to offer to Taiwanese people. So therefore, before his election, he published a significant book titled Native Spirit, the Model Story of Taiwan. And then he challenged the 400 years history of Taiwan called 400 Years of Strategy, where he emphasized the contribution of Qing administration, Qing dynasty administrators, such as Liu Mingchuan, or the last ROC leader, such as Jiang Jingguo, the heir of Chiang Kai-shek, right, to Taiwan's modernization. So what we understand is that in his inaugural address, he described the people on both sides of Taiwanese stride as part of Zhonghua Minzu. Zhonghua Minzu, or Chinese nation, is the term that first was brought to the public by Sun Yat-sen or Sun Yat-sen in 1905, and then when the Republic of China was declared in 1912. And this concept of Zhonghua Minzu means that we all are the Chinese nation, regardless our ethnicity. So imagine bringing something like back in 2008 was like implementing a plan of forced and not discussed with public concept of Minzu referred to a common Russian cultural identity. And as a symbolic thing, he even renamed Taiwan Post back to China Post. So its original name before the Chen Shui-bian presidency. So now going to the recent times with the President Tsai Ing-wen. Well, we will also try to refer to her inaugural speech, where what she did is she acknowledged the existence of 1992 negotiations, but she omitted any reference to the One China principle. It happened in 2016. Negotiations, but not consensus, because it's also a political creation of the strategists that were working for Ma Ying-jeou. But it was never recognized as a, it's only a Chinese propaganda success that in many deliberations, in many discussions, people still use the term 1992 consensus. There was no any consensus. It's a pure intellectual production, nothing that has any evidence in the any facts. Of course, there were negotiations, and that's the only fact. But anyway, after Ma came to power in 2008, we know, not about Ma, but about Tsai Ing-wen. What she said 5 years later, after the second term started, we don't have a need to declare ourselves an independent state. We are an independent country already. We call ourselves Republic of China, Taiwan. And we do have a government, we do have the military, we do have a certain election orders, tax system, administration, whatsoever. So President Tsai created an entirely new name for the state she governs. And she called it literally the Republic of China, Taiwan, 中华民国台湾. So we are in a very specific moment now that we have a new term created, although it's not an official recognized term, but this is the reference for most of Taiwanese people and for the society to identify them with in terms of national identity referred to a state. And going to the end of my presentation, just some remarks concerning some other aspects of national identity and the process in making what is happening now in Taiwan. We can see that there's a sort of a decline recently of identity policies, which could reflect a diversification of the ways to Taiwanese, the strengthening of the local identities in different parts of the island. So part of the resilience is we're taking, it is a big factor here. And Taiwanese identity is, what we can observe with the young generation especially, is sort of, I would say, taken for granted. So in other words, there is a decline of identity politics, and it's a sign of the maturation of a society and perhaps consolidation of the Taiwanese democracy. These processes we know very well from Europe, from grown up, or let's say matured democratic societies, something that is taken for granted. And then the young generation has not any opportunity or intellectual skills to see any danger coming from outside. And then as a part of conclusion, I would say that the gap between the aspiration to build a distinct and new Taiwanese nation and the geopolitical reality and political options that can be contemplated is widening. It's really something what is happening now in Taiwan. And this distinction between state and national identity has clearly disappeared. That's mostly due to the very consequent policy of the recent administration of President Tsai Ing-wen and her creation of a sort of a name which is consistent with her all policy and all her public presentations that she is making within the last 6-7 years. So the Taiwanese civic identity that has emerged today identifies only with the ROC Taiwan for Taiwan, which is just like a legacy of Li Tenghui, who liked to call in the late 90s the Republic of China on Taiwan. So for most Taiwanese, it's a form of a national identity. That's what we can see here. I know that time is running quite quickly, so maybe I will just do.
Unfortunately, it is, yes.
To the last one.
Please try to sum up.
Yes, so the 2021 referendum was a very good example about how national identity is understood or dominates everything else in Taiwan. Regardless of what was the topic of referendum that took place, the ballot shows that most of the answers were no, but the result was a show of support for the Democratic Progressive Party, which has campaigned for people to reject the entire referendum to protect Taiwan's democratic values. So democratic values, understanding of state or civic identity, along with the state recognition of Republic of China, Taiwan, this is what is a dominating process or dominating processes within the realm of national identity on Formosa. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Professor Gatza. Of course, amazing, important, and very complicated topic. I would add only shortly that it was also the second term presidential elections at the beginning of 2020, which was also very important. So it was this time, the year 2019, the year before COVID, where some of us were present on Taiwan, was absolutely changing the attitude of Taiwanese society towards this bipartisan perspective, which for Taiwan is very important for understanding this identity in the making that you were talking about. That is very, very insightful, and we learned so much. For now, I would like to admit that we are not going to end the panel clearly in 10:45, but we still have some minutes, I think we will end it at 11. So Professor Beata Bochorodycz from the Faculty of Modern Languages and Literature of Mickiewicz University, presently in Japan, and Professor Beata Bochorodycz is also co-organizer of the conference. So she's going to moderate next panel. So also it's up to her how long she will speak right now. Professor Beata, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. I really wish I could be in person with you in Poznań, but of course, on the other hand, I am very happy to be in Japan. And actually, I am in Okinawa doing field research and just returned from the American military bases and having some talks on the security issues. So I am very glad that Professor Hosoya presented this broader background picture of the security environment surrounding Japan. And I can only say that at least people that I talked to, and they are representing the US forces in Japan, at least partially, I think in majority they would agree with points made by Professor Hosoya. I knew I was going to talk after two really great experts on of Japanese security, of his Asian security policy. So I decided to focus on basically one point. And let me first share my presentation. I hope it works. Could you please let me know if you can see my presentation, because that's always tricky. Could you please give me a sign that you can see the presentation? Okay,
yes,
thank you.
Yes, we do, yeah.
Okay, thank you. As I said, I decided to focus on one really big point, both from theoretical perspective and from a micro perspective, to give you some insights in the changes that we are witnessing right now in Japan in relation to foreign policy. But let me just start from this quote. This is from this morning, Kyodo News, and it refers to Taiwan. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and US President Joe Biden are set to affirm in a joint statement that they will strengthen cooperation towards stability in the Taiwan Strait when they meet next week in Tokyo. And I was very happy to see this article, because it basically certifies to the main point that I am trying to make. Basically, that Japanese security policy is undergoing a big shift. But first, let's look at the status quo. So what's the Taiwan's position in Japanese foreign policy, and more precisely, of course, in the security policy. So when we look at the diplomatic book, the most recent of 2021, it clearly states that for Japan, Taiwan is an extremely crucial partner and an important friend with which it shares fundamental values such as freedom, democracy, basic human rights, and the rule of law, and enjoys close economic relations and people-to-people exchanges. The relationship between Japan and Taiwan is maintained on the basis of working relations at the non-governmental level, in accordance with the 1972 joint communique between Japan and China. So basically, it means that Japan still maintains and upholds the One China policy. At the same time, the first part that I highlighted, extremely crucial partner and important friend, has been changed since, if I remember correctly, 2019, upgrading the importance and position of Taiwan. On the other hand, the Defense White Book, the most recent of 2021, although it mentions Taiwan as many as 50 times, It doesn't, of course, refer to Taiwan as a security partner, because Taiwan is not a security partner yet, but it's very important for Japan's regional security environment. So coming from this, at least in the formal documents from this position, so the main point that I would like to make is that, as I said, that we are witnessing a policy shift and on both international and domestic levels. The international level, the international environment, I think, was very well presented by Professor Hosoya. But in addition to the issue, the situation surrounding Taiwan in relation to China's policy towards Taiwan, as well as US-China relations, we also have this new important critical situation, which is war in Ukraine, which has been discussed in Japan very extensively. This is one of the major topics since the war broke out. And I think it creates what John Kingston's call for a policy change, a window of opportunity to change a policy. And on the domestic factors, we have a fairly big group of political actors, to use again this term of Kingston's, of policy entrepreneurs, that is, political actors with certain policy ideas and blueprints to change this policy, and that show certain political will to engage in actions toward changing this policy. The last point of changing public opinion in favor of changing security policy, I will skip because of the time limits, but it's I just would like to point out that it's also right now is in the state of shifting. So to give you a few examples of that statements by political actors, important political and influential political actors, Vice Minister of Defense Nakayama Yasuhida, for example, in Hudson, stated that Taiwan must be protected as a fellow democracy, and that Japan and Taiwan aren't only friends, they are family. On the other hand, Deputy Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Asotaro, at the meeting of the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party in Japan, last July, stated that Japan would have to defend Taiwan with the United States if the island is invaded by mainland China. If Taiwan were to experience a big problem, it would not be too much to say that it could relate to a survival threatening situation for Japan. So these are very clear statements. And of course, one of the most vocal, also to some extent controversial, has been former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, the real game changer, the one of the biggest and strongest forces behind the shifts in Japan's foreign policy in the post-war, or at least in the post-Cold War period. So Prime Minister, it was actually at the think tank in Taiwan, the Institute for National Policy Research in Taiwan, where he stated that Taiwan's emergency is a Japanese emergency, and therefore an emergency for Japan-US alliance.
People. Good morning for
people. Sorry, I can hear voices.
No, I'm just trying to follow the fucking class. It's not a class, it's seminars.
Oops, some students probably don't know, they didn't.
Excuse me, for some of participants, please turn off your microphones. Thank you.
Yeah, it's better to be aware where you are swearing. But anyway, people in Beijing, to continue the quote, President Xi Jinping in particular should never have a misunderstanding in recognizing this. And so these are just few examples of very influential political leaders that voice the need for policy change. But organizationally and institutionally, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party also established Taiwan Project Team in February 21, which is headed by LDP's Chief of Foreign Affairs division, Sato Masahisa, who is retired Self-Defense Force colonel and an expert in defense and security issues. And also Sato called for a new law similar to the Taiwan Relation Act in Japan, and proposed a 2+2 dialogue among the foreign and defense ministers of Japan and Taiwan. These are probably one of the most, I would say, radical statements, but at the same time, as I said, organization LDP is supporting policy change. In June 2021, the project team handed recommendations that repeated this phrase that the crisis in Taiwan is our own crisis, that Japan should support Taiwan to join international organizations, should increase ODA support to countries recognizing Taiwan, should deepen Japan-Taiwan relations, encourage increased dialogue with Chinese officials and organizations. And I think this is what actually is happening. Should bolster Japan's deterrence capabilities, strengthen supply chains with Taiwan and Taiwanese companies. And Stephen was extensively talking on that particular on this point. And finally, support Taiwan to join like-minded partners under the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific framework. And this was, I think, Yuichi is also one of the points. So to the conclusions, because I would like to leave some time for discussion, to repeat this argument. So on the international level, the intense or increasingly intense situation surrounding Taiwan, as well as the war in Ukraine, have opened a window of opportunity for security policy change in Japan. And on the other hand, in the domestic arena, we have this group of policy entrepreneurs, really influential policy actors that have already certain policy ideas, blueprints to change Japan's security policy. And in addition, there is also, we have been witnessing an increasing public support for policy changes. So therefore, it's very highly probable that we are going to see a security policy shift towards more proactive, offensive. In Japan, it's at the moment the term counter-attack posture is being used. And within this deepening of the security cooperation between Japan and Taiwan. And of course, the question remains to what extent this policy will change. And I think this is also a good topic for further discussion at our panel. With this, I would like to conclude. Thank you.
Professor Beata Bochorodycz, thank you very much also for your time discipline. It is absolutely for us crucial here also to have some minutes of discussion. So I would like to ask also Mr. Chen Ihua from the next panel to also to present some patience. We will continue soon the second panel, but please let us think that we will be able to prolong the second panel. So now I would like to ask you to raise some questions and I would like to start the discussion, please. Saying it, I really would wish to thank Professor Hosoya, Professor Nagy, Professor Gaca, and Professor Bochorodycz for all very excellent presentations and also time discipline. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So before other people start, maybe I would like to ask a question to Yuichi, who is a great expert on Japanese security, about this security policy change towards Taiwan. How far do you think the Japanese government can actually go with changes under current situation?
Professor Yuichi, you can answer directly.
Okay, thank you very much, Beata, for your great question. And well, it depends on how we evaluate the change. But basically, I think that the Japanese experts are saying that even pro-Taiwan Prime Minister Shinzo Abe could not radically change Japan's Taiwan policy. One of the biggest reasons is, as I mentioned, and as others speakers touched upon, we need to stick to China's one China policy. And this is one thing. The other thing is that Japan, the biggest trading partner is China. That's why Japanese government has no real significant attitudes to radically change our policy towards China. But the other thing is that the United States has been, in the last several years, gradually changing its own Taiwan policy. And as long as Japan is sticking to the US-Japan alliance, we need to be, the Japanese government needs to be flexible to adjust to the changes which the US governments have been showing. So in that sense, our change is not radical, but gradual. But undoubtedly, well, I think that it is true that, as is mentioned in your presentation, that the Taiwanese people are becoming more independent from mainland China in their own national identity. But they don't regard, the Taiwanese people don't now regard that they are part of China. They are Taiwanese. So in that sense, we have to, Japan needs to adjust to two changes, the change of American policy towards Taiwan, and also the change of Taiwanese conception of national identity. And adjusting to these changes, I think that Japan has showing a kind of a quite gradual, flexible adjustment to these changes.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Professor Hosoya.
Right. I have a question.
Thank you. Professor Hosoya, I have a question to you then, because to some extent it's also it's connected with what Beata presented, but in what way you should understand recent statements of Prime Minister Abe? Because we know that he created the mindset of the policy in recent years, and he influenced the Japanese policy and the regional security in a very vast way. And just recently, in late February, he has another interview with the Nikkei Asia, when he said that Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency. So even said that he explained that Japan's westernmost inhabited island of Yonaguni is just very close to Taiwan and mainland, and if China were to conduct an operation, it will first seek to establish air and sea superiority in Taiwan. So if it were to secure wide air superiority, it would also cover Japanese airspace. So it's quite intriguing to what way for me, and this is my question, we can understand, what is still the importance of Shinzo Abe remarks, in particular this sort of remarks, also in combination of that we know that strategic ambiguity, which is the core of American policy to Taiwan, is changing now. Thank you.
Shall we there's a question from Mr. Yuichi as well, or shall I?
Yes, if I can add something. Sorry, Stephen has to leave soon because he has some other arrangements. So I would maybe propose a question first to Stephen and return to this conversation if we can.
Of course. So any question to Professor Nagy?
One more for me.
Or maybe Stephen can respond to several questions which already raised, because he's a great expert on Japanese Asian policy, Indo-Pacific policy. So if Stephen has anything to comment on these questions.
Sure. Professor Nagy, please, we are all ears.
So thank you very much for this opportunity. And again, my apologies for having to leave in probably 3 or 4 minutes. I think former Prime Minister Abe's statements are important from probably 3 levels. First, again, is clearly articulating to both Beijing and Taiwan the importance that Japan places on Taiwan in its security outlook. And I think I don't see it controversial. If there's friction across the Taiwan Straits, this will affect sea lines of communication, the arteries that transport goods in and out of the Japanese economy, and energy. This is not brain surgery, it's just a matter of fact. And Japan has a deep interest in ensuring that this is stable and that the governance of sea lines of communication remain governed by international law or shared understanding. And I think that he's trying to ensure that this is clearly communicated to both Beijing and Taiwan. Second, I think that it's an effort to continue to put his stamp on Japanese foreign policy over the long term. The free and open Indo-Pacific vision really comes from Prime Minister Abe's foreign policy team. And it is clearly linked to Japan's long-term interests, again, in sea lines of communication that stretch from the East China Sea through the Taiwan Straits to the South China Sea. Without clear access to the South China Sea, consumers, resources, the Japanese economy or Japan's economic security will be severely damaged. This is clearly, and it's a clear vision. Third, and I think importantly, Prime Minister Abe has been trying to be an articulate communicator that Japan needs to shift its security mindset to deal with the realities of an assertive China, as well as, quite frankly, a Pyongyang, which is continuing to develop weapons of mass destruction, and that a successful China or a successful North Korea will fundamentally undermine the peace and stability within the region and the American-based security architecture. So again, I see him as a communicator, as an educator, and someone that's trying to influence the debate domestically and internationally.
Thank you very much. I don't know, it's maybe we can pass the voice for Professor Chen Yihua, who's raising his hand. He is going to present soon as his presentation, but let us use this situation to continue discussion. Please, Professor Chen.
Right. My question is for everyone in this panel. So anyone would answer is fine. I want to know what is the differences between Japan's one China policy and United States one China policy. Right. I feel they are very similar, but I do see there are some differences between these two. So I'm wondering what is your ideas about this, because it had everything to do with security of Taiwan. Thank you.
So Nagy, would wish to refer to this?
I think that Japan's geographic proximity to Taiwan, the realities that its economy is clearly linked to stable sea lines of communication, and that its biggest trading partner includes Greater China, that's Taiwan, Hong Kong, and part of China, that Japan must maintain a one China policy. Now, that one China policy, in my understanding, does not preclude Japan from building non-state relations with Taiwan to solve problems between Taiwan and to solve problems within the region. A very good example of that is Japan's Fishery Association and Taiwan's Fishery Association has agreed to jointly use the resources in and around the Senkaku Islands. From my standpoint, Japan will continue to abide by the one China policy, while at the same time continue to strengthen relations at the non-state level to build a multi-layered relationship that continues to strengthen the relations of Japanese people and Taiwanese people with the interest of maintaining, again, peace and stability within the region. I apologize, I need to go. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. And again, my best to all of you. And
Thank you, Professor Nagy, for your presence. And from our side, we apologize for having these little troubles with time, but we try to do our best. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Would it be anyone who would wish to refer to Professor Chen's question?
Maybe may I? Of course, Stephen has already answered brilliantly to the question coming from Mr. Yuichi Chen. And I think that there are several differences in addition to what Stephen already mentioned. One of the things is that the legalization process, how to legalize our foreign policy towards Taiwan based upon one China policy. Both Japan and the United States have been respecting China's one China policy, but at the same time, legalizations are different, which means that Japan doesn't have a Taiwan Relations Act. So the United States has been acting based upon that act. And there are some people in Japan who are saying that Japan should have our own Taiwan Relations Act, which can actually approach to China much more deeply. So American engagement to Taiwan is much deeper, like its defense commitment and otherwise. But on the other hand, the other thing is that we had, the Japan have war memory, historical issues with Taiwan, with China. And also we have territorial dispute. Of course, the Japanese government does not fully acknowledge the existence of territorial dispute. But in reality, we have a territorial dispute with China. So based upon these differences, the historical memory issues and also territorial disputes, it means that Taiwanese issue is much more sensitive to Japan. So maybe Japanese approach to Taiwan is much more careful than American approach to Taiwan because of that geographical differences, geopolitical situation, historical difference, and so on. So there are several significant differences between Japanese approach to Taiwan and American approach to Taiwan. And also, I think that I have other question about Abe's recent comments on Taiwan's issues. On this as well, Stephen already answered brilliantly on this question, but in addition to that, Abe has been promoting, when he was a prime minister twice, Abe has been promoting Japan's value-oriented diplomacy. It means that Japan should align with like-minded liberal democracies. So, Taiwan is variable democratic entity in the Indo-Pacific region. That's why if we abandon Taiwan, it means that we lose important democracy, whichever the national status is. But anyway, it is necessary for Japan, according to Abe, to promote such cooperation among democracies, including Taiwan. But this is one important thing. And the other thing is that based upon that value-oriented diplomacy, I think that, as I explained in my talk, Taiwan is in the middle of extremely complicated security realities. It means that if Japanese people think that Taiwan contingency is not the Japanese contingency, it means that we will take a distance from that issue. And if Japanese government take a distance from that issues, it means that it will be very difficult for the United States to engage in the issue militarily because of the complicated nature of Japanese stance on American military bases in Japanese soil. So it is imperative for Japan to fully acknowledge American usage of military bases in Japan to maintain American deterrence towards China, not to invade Taiwan. So I think the main purpose of former Prime Minister Abe to mention this was to clearly appeal the strength of deterrence of the American commitment to Taiwan, to try to dissuade Chinese government, the Beijing government, to invade Taiwan militarily. I think this is the essential message of former Prime Minister Abe on this issue.
Thank you, Professor Hosoya, very much for this answer. The time is unfortunately running, so thank you, Professor Chen, for your question. I would only say one word that perhaps from the Taiwanese perspective towards your question, it's also very often that it is seen that Japanese-American perspective is very similar. So we may say that it's both. In details, we can see the differences, but as well in general perspective, I think at least for last years, we can see the highly harmonized perspective. So from my side, I would wish to thank you all for your participation in this panel, for your questions, for your answers. And I would wish to pass the voice to the moderation professor of the second panel, Professor Beata Bochorodycz. And next, as I believe, Professor Chen Yihua presentation. Professor Beata, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and apologies for this delay. I really envy you that you can continue this discussion later on during the break and in the evening, but let's move to the second panel, and let me just introduce our speakers. First, and apologies if I mispronounce it, Yuichi Chen from Akita International University in Japan, then Liang-Chi Evans Chen from the Division of National Defense Strategy and Resources, Institute for National Defense and Security Research, and third, Rafał Wiśniewski from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. Since we are a little bit late, I would, but only having 3 presentations, I think save us a little bit time, but I would like to ask Professor Yuichi Chen to start his presentations. How long can we extend this panel? This is the question to my colleagues.
Yes, we are thinking that we can prolong it for 15 minutes, so we will be able to continue till 12 Polish time.
Okay, great. So without further ado, Professor Chen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Beata. And hello, everyone. My name is Yuichi Chen. I'm from Akita International University. First of all, please let me say thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference for the second time. And I'm very happy today because when I was drafting my paper for last year conference, I'm talking about the changes of Japanese identities. And I read a lot of work from Professor Hosoya, and today he is here, right? All right, so my topic today is about the potential linkage between Taiwan and Ukraine. And I want to answer this question: Has Russia's invasion of Ukraine really reduced the likelihood of China's war over Taiwan? This is kind of a million-dollar question that every scholars and a lot of citizens in the world, they are trying to answer. So today I'm going to provide my perspective and some of my analysis in here. So first of all, there are some of very important similarities between Taiwan and Ukraine. And although China, Foreign Minister of China Wang Yi tried to deny the potential possibility that we can link Taiwan with Ukraine, and also U.S. Defense Minister Lloyd Austin also denied such a possibility. But I do see there are some important similarity between Taiwan and Ukraine. For example, number one, both Taiwan and Ukraine, they are all small countries standing on the front line of resisting authoritarian territorial ambition. And this point already made by Professor Hosoya. Ukraine took over the eastern, Russia took over the eastern part of Ukraine in 2014 and keep strengthening Ukraine. And so does China, so does how China strengthened Taiwan since 1949, right? And second similarity, both Russia and China, they back up their legitimacy of use of force against their small neighbor by history. This history, of course, is very very one-sided. Russia say Ukraine has never been an independent country. It has been always part of Russia. And China used the same history as well, saying Taiwan has never been an independent country and has been always part of China. But of course, we know that history is not the truth. And the third similarity is the role of the United States. United States is the leader of NATO. So how United States respond to the challenge from Russia weighed heavily for the other leaders in Western Europe. And of course, United States is the only major and the most important security provider for Taiwan by its One China policy and TRA. So this leads to the final similarity because of the involvement of the United States. Both China and Russia see their small neighbors as a source of a security threat, which kind of strengthen their determination of use of force. But again, this is not the truth because joining NATO is for defense purpose, and the United States never back up any invasion of Taiwan against China, like Chiang Kai-shek during the Cold War. Even during the Cold War, the United States never back up Chiang Kai-shek's military campaign of eradicating Taiwan, right? So same thing applies today. So based on these four important similarities, many scholars and commentators or officials, they try to answer this question, whether this Russia's war over Ukraine really increase or decrease the likelihood of China's war over Taiwan. And most of it, they will say already reduced for these two important reasons. First one, Russia's own failure on its battleground. So what we have seen over the past 3 months was Russia's war over Ukraine was really a failure in a number of ways. We see a problems in logistics. We see the problems of a lack of air cover. And we also see the problem of getting support from other countries. So in many ways, Russia only make a lot of enemies by himself. Right now, Finland and Sweden, they also want to join NATO, which is something Putin doesn't really want to see. Right. And so it's very interesting. Right now, Russia's war over Ukraine is like Chinese version of a Vietnam War in 1978. Although China want to teach Vietnamese a lesson, but in reality, that is the other way around. It is the Vietnamese teach China a lesson, right? So this is the one important reason people say probably this war already changed the political calculus of Xi Jinping. The second reason is the credibility of deterrence of Taiwan against China has been increased by the effort by Taiwan, Japan, and the United States all together. For example, Taiwanese government has been doing this kind of reserve forces reform for quite a while. And at the very beginning, this kind of reform was not very popular. But when the Russian war happens, you can see the supportedness of Taiwanese people to have a better resource forces reform has been increased. And we do see many policy makers or lawmakers or even civil groups start to advocate even more ambitious reserve forces reform, like have a better training and a quicker gathering speed. And especially this kind of reform also backed up by Tsai Ing-wen herself when she met the National Endowment for Democracy, President Damon Wilson on March 29th. This is what she said, quote, Taiwanese admire how Ukraine's territorial defense forces are playing an important role in protecting their nation. Through the whole of society approach, President Wilson, I understand that you not only work with Ukraine civil groups, but also territorial defense group in Sweden and Finland. This kind of cooperation is very meaningful. Taiwan hopes to have opportunity to be part of related exchanges so that we can learn from others' experience. This will help us further mobilize and all out defense and enhance resilience across all facets of a society. Right, so we do see more and more people arguing along this line. Taiwan need to build its own territorial defense forces. This is not military force, but try to train civil society to have a better way to defend Taiwan if this war really happened. And the United States, when after this war happens, you can see a lot of important politicians from the United States start to visit Taiwan, like Mike Pompeo, and also many U.S. senators visit Taiwan across different parties. And also, Antony Blinken, when he was interviewed whether the United States will protect Taiwan if it was invaded by China, and Antony Blinken said, "We will make sure that China will not go down this path." So in many ways, Americans are sending a political message to Chinese that do not ever think about trying to invade Taiwan, try to strengthen this deterrence capability. And the behavior of Japan, I believe our other panelists in here from Japan can provide more information. We already read a lot of information from Peter and Professor Hosoya here. So let me just skip this part. So based on these two important reasons, many have argued Xi Jinping's political calculus may have changed. But my argument is not really. Maybe we need to think twice when we jump to this conclusion, right? Because this analysis above has been, the way I said it is based on these four important flawed assumptions. The first one, the deterrence capability of Taiwan and its allies, is the single most important factor for Beijing's use of force. As a scholar on China study, I would say the most important factor when it comes to whether China to use force has been always the power struggle inside the Chinese Communist Party. If history serves as a guide, we look at examples like the Korean War, like the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis in 1958, or China's ambush of the Soviet Union in 1969, right? The most dominant factor has been always domestic power struggles, right? And other important factors like economic crisis or dysfunctional of collective leadership or the hostile international environment, these kind of factors are all still existing in nowadays China, right? So I would say deterrence is very important, but maybe not the most important thing, and maybe not the only factor that we can deter whether we can deter potential war of China against Taiwan. So this is number one flawed assumptions in my view. Second, the definition of victory for China is a territorial occupation. If we look at the history of the PRC, how PRC fought war against others, it never shows any ambition of taking other countries' territory. What he did most of the time is just ambush or strike, just to show it there to use of force. Use of force for him itself, for China itself, is a victory, right? So the definition of China in terms of victory is very different from what we used to understand, right? Chinese way of use of force has tend to trying to deter potential enemies' invasion or try to change the situation when China see the situation going down the path with no return. So China will use force, but never try to occupy other countries' territory. Even if you look at the case of 2012, when China took over Philippines' Gulf Show, it did not use force, but tried to use coercion forces or in kind of a gray zone tactics, right? So my perspective is if China is going to use force, probably will use some kind of gray zone tactics. And well, against the islands around Taiwan, not Taiwan Island itself, probably in Jinmen, Maju, or Paratas, or Ituaba, right? So when many people comment whether China will launch a war against Taiwan, this is another problematic assumption when I see this kind of comment, right? The third problematic assumption is China's war plan over Taiwan does not take into the factors of the United States and Japan into calculation. No, it is not. Since 1996, when the United States sent 2 aircraft carrier strike group to Taiwan, leaders in Beijing already include this factor that the United States will involve, right? And to some extent, Japan will involve. This is something believed by many PLA generals as well. If you seriously examine the PLA's generals' writing in their articles, no one ever dared to get rid of US factors or Japanese factors. So with or without this Ukraine war, I believe China's war plan over Taiwan already include the factor of the United States and Japan already. We do see some of information, or some people argue United States not going to come to defense of Taiwan, but I would say that those information, most of them they are from the Chinese propaganda system, try to launch a disinformation campaign against Taiwanese determination, right? So the final flaw assumptions is China has lost its patience with Taiwan. My own assessment is China hasn't. If China already lost its patience with Taiwan, then we will see some signals like People's Daily will heavily criticize the leader in Taiwan, attack their personalities in a very harsh way. If history serves some examples, this is what Chinese propaganda did during the 1996, the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, and this is what the Chinese propaganda did during when in the Mao era, when Mao launched a number of wars against other countries. And also we may see China start to mobilize or start to seriously prepare its amphibious landing abilities. But nowadays, what we see, the PLA is trying to strengthen and develop its A2AD skills and try to enhance its second strike abilities. So I would say China hasn't lost its patience with Taiwan yet, although many scholars comment otherwise, but my own assessment is China hasn't. So this is my conclusions to answer this question. Has the Russian invasion of Ukraine really increased or decreased the likelihood of China's war over Taiwan? I would say probably not as much as we believe. And probably leader in Beijing will learn a lot from this experience to strengthen or to perfect its war plan over Taiwan, maybe in 10 or even after 20 years. All right, so I will stop in here. Looking forward to any questions and discussion afterward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and insightful presentation, and also for keeping the time. And let's move to the second presenter, Professor Liang Qi Evans Chen. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. So also can see my slides on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Liang Qi Evans Chen from the INDSR, a think tank sponsored by Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense in Taipei, Taiwan. So it's my great pleasure to join the conference at the first time. And the topic I want to talk about is related to a comparisons recently between the case of Ukraine versus Russia and the case of Taiwan versus China. So what lessons we can learn from the comparison. So well, in the case of the war in Ukraine, people always, recently probably not talk about that too much, but just at the beginning of the war, I think people talk about a lot about the Ukraine today, and that would be Taiwan tomorrow. So to me, definitely, I would not see the war in Ukraine will be a battle or a war in Taiwan or in the Taiwan Strait or tomorrow or in the future. So definitely not a battle, not a war. But on the other hand, I think I would say definitely that would be yes to see Ukraine today, and that would be also Taiwan tomorrow. Because let's look at the courage and the bravery and the intelligence of the Ukraine political elites or Ukrainian people's struggle for the war. I think that would be a good example for Taiwan, not only Taiwan, but also for the democracies. And this also reminds me that just last year, in the middle of last year, we also see, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. So people also said that Afghanistan today, and that will be also Taiwan tomorrow. And definitely, I would say it's not. No, we will not see, the U.S. What the U.S. encountered in Afghanistan will be also what the U.S. face in Taiwan or in the Taiwan Strait. So I think the cases of Ukraine and Afghanistan are quite critical for us to think about, tomorrow or the future of Taiwan. But from other, perspective, I would say, yes. Well, in the case of Russia and the case of China, probably, I would say yes, Russia today, and that will be also China tomorrow. Look at the rudeness and the atrocity and authoritarianism and the revisionist power. Definitely, Russia are very similar to China. Both of these two powers are quite similar. And also, in my person, or for the people in Taiwan, we will also like to see, yes, Moscow's value today in Ukraine, and hopefully that will be also China's future straight. So it just depends on, what kind of a perspective you look at the issue. So to me, I think there are two hypotheses in the case of Ukraine and in the case of Taiwan. These two hypotheses are as followed. So if Moscow conducts the warfare in Ukraine quickly and it goes very well, it will be discouraging to Taipei and also encouraging to Beijing. But in contrast, if Moscow conducts the warfare slowly and it goes very poorly or goes not very well in Ukraine, it will be encouraging to Taipei and also discouraging to Beijing. And so far, it seems, the second hypothesis is much more real in reality. So I think that's quite positive to not only Taiwan, but also Japan, the US, and the democracies. So here is a quite important question for us. So will China abandon its ambition or its plan of invading Taiwan as Moscow is frustrated in Ukraine's battlefields? And that is also kind of, for many international media, is surprising and discouraging to Beijing. So will China abandon its ambition or plan of invading of Taiwan? So let's look at the similarities and the differences between these two cases. So Ukraine and Russia versus Russia, and the Taiwan versus China. So let's look at the similarity first. I think Ukraine and Taiwan, both of these two countries are, well, like Professor Chen mentioned, that these two are small and relatively weak compared to their rivals. And also these two are defensive. In contrast, Russia and China, both of these two are big and military strong, and these two are offensive. And second, let's look at Ukraine and Taiwan. Both of these two are focused on asymmetrical warfare. So Taiwan learned lots of lessons or experience of Ukraine or the war in Ukraine to emphasize UAV, unmanned aviation vehicles, and also Javelin, this kind of tiny missile system. and Stingers and the land-based missiles. So that's what I think these two similarities that's quite significant in these two cases. And let's move on to look at the perspective of differences. So the first one is we can see the war in Ukraine is continental on the continent. And then the case of Taiwan or the Taiwan contingency will be oceanic. That will be on the ocean or the Taiwan Strait. Okay. And second one, geographically, well, based on the first one, we can imagine that well, the Russia depends on a huge amount of army to attack Ukraine. And in the case of China, Beijing will be depend on a huge number of navy first and then army later. Number three, so Russia and China, well, both of them, they can conduct air force at the missile strikes. So at this point, I'm not very sure to say it's kind of similarity or differences between the case of Ukraine and the case of Taiwan. Probably that will be much more like, similarities. That will be kind of, military strategy for Russia and China. Okay, number four, we can see what in general, Taiwan's military power is much greater than Ukraine's military power. But relatively, China's military power is also much greater than the military power of Russia. So here comes a very interesting observation, or very important observation for us. We might need to measure or to figure out the gap between China's military power and Taiwan's military power, and the gap between Russia's military power and Ukraine's military power. So if the gap between China's and Taiwan's is greater or much greater than the gap between Russia's and Ukraine's, definitely that would be much risky for Taiwan, and that would be kind of advantageous for Beijing to initiate, to launch a battle or a military action in the Taiwan Strait. Okay, this page is about the differences, the second part. So let's look at political dimension. Politically, Ukraine has no Ukraine Relations Act with either the United States or with European Union or with Japan. But Taiwan has Taiwan Relations Act, TRA, with the United States or from the United States. But on this point, it's hard to say, even you have the kind of Relations Act, and that will be kind of, a guarantee, or that will be kind of strong promise to defend either Ukraine or Taiwan. So it's hard to say, if you have a real domestic act or law in the United States, and that would, prove or would demonstrate that, the U.S. stands on the war in Ukraine or on the war in Taiwan. So, and then interestingly, and strangely, Ukraine is recognized as a sovereign state in the international society, but Taiwan is not. So probably we can move further to talk about, as a sovereign state or the international recognitions, is important to the nation which is invaded by a strong neighboring power to ask for international support or international assistance. So is that necessary or is not? And then we can see Ukraine faces with strategic clarity at the beginning of the war, which means that the US, just right at the beginning of the war, announced that Washington would not send American troops to participate in the war. But during the past almost 3 months, we can see Washington and its allies continues providing other military assistance, such as weapons, budgets, intelligences, and the trainings to Ukraine. But in the case of Taiwan, Taiwan faces with strategic ambiguity, I think all the time, which means that Washington's emphasize again and again that the US will not clearly participate in the war or in the Taiwan's contingency, but the US guarantee and the promise to help the islands to have strong and significant self-defense against China's invasions. So that's one dimension. And the other is that, we can still see Washington conduct its strong, military presence in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. And definitely the US also provides other military assistance to the island, to Taiwan. So last one, compared to Russia, China has relatively strong globalization and economic interdependence with the world. So on this point, that would be a little bit or very difficult for us to assess if the US and the West can conduct a similar economic and technological sanctions against Russia, and to take that kind of sanctions similarly in the case of China, if Beijing launch a war or launch a military action in the Taiwan Strait. The key is that the US and the West and China are both quite highly economic interdependence. So it's hard to assess or to evaluate which side or which part will be damaged by the other side in the sanctions or in the economic sanctions. And another uncertainty is that so far it's quite a little bit difficult for us to assess the effect or the effectiveness of the decoupling of the United States over the past years. Well, we can see the US and the US and the West try to conduct or promote decoupling to decrease its dependence on China. But so far, still we cannot see a very clear outcome of the decoupling. So that means that the restructuring of the supply chain or the restructuring of the economic interdependence, that will be still uncertain for the US and the West. And that will be a little bit difficult to evaluate if the US will take the similar economic sanctions against Russia in the case of China. Okay, so these are the observations I have regarding the comparisons on these two cases. So I will just stop here and then we'll see if you have any question or we can discuss later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this very extensive and very thorough presentation. I think we'll collect questions at the end. So maybe I would ask my colleague, Rafał Wiśniewski, for his presentation. Rafał, the floor is yours. We are running out of time. I'm really sorry for the previous panel because we took your time, and here you are. Rafał, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope we can hear each other and that my presentation is visible. So my presentation is very much complementary to the two previous speakers. So I will just try to focus on some of the points. What I'm interested in my research is the perspective of strategic studies and different models that were developed throughout the years to trying to explain how states decide to use military force and in what conditions. And of course, this is very applicable to the current situation and all the comparisons we are making in this panel between the situation of Taiwan and Ukraine. So generally, yes, it works. So in strategic studies, we understand strategic stability as a likelihood that in a crisis, actually military force will be used, as divided into these two components, crisis stability and arms race stability. But generally, I would like to focus on the factors that might have led Russian government to the decision to escalate Russian-Ukraine war to full-scale invasion in February this year, and try to make some kind of comparison with the decision calculus that the government of People's Republic of China is now facing regarding the Taiwan situation. So Professor Chen already made, and both of the presenters made a very good comparison of similarities in the situation of Ukraine and Taiwan. So I will not repeat this. I would just highlight that for a large part of what we call post-Cold War period, the constant political conflict over the alignment and political future of both Ukraine and Taiwan, they were to some degree mitigated by the dominance of the liberal international order under the leadership of United States, and by a tendency that, for example, Gardsky in his article called Capitalist Peace, the tendency of even those authoritarian powers like Russia and China to prioritize economic development in cooperation with this liberal international system. But now we see that both long-running political conflicts concerning Ukraine's future and concerning Taiwan's future are generating a more heightened state of political military crisis. So what changed then that the situation became more tense? Well, the long-term preferences of Russia and China towards these two separate situations did not change, but the international balance of power changed with at least a perception, if not what we could agree on as an objective reality of decline of the West, which was especially visible in declarations of the Chinese leadership after the financial crisis, that United States and its power are in decline. And as was very ably demonstrated also by Professor Gatza in earlier panel, the change in identity and domestic political dynamics in Taiwan, but also in Ukraine. And I think maybe not the key, but very important factor to consider when thinking about Russian decision-making in its conflict with Ukraine. And this can also be very important for considering China's move towards Taiwan. It's what is used in deterrence theory, the prospects theory taken from economics. So prospects theory tries to assess how much of a risk decision-making authority is willing to make, how much cost it is willing to risk in particular situation to further its interests. And prospects theory tells us that it's very much dependent on whether this decision maker or makers are in the gain frame, so whether they are satisfied with the status quo and they believe that as time progresses, their position would be generally favorable. And then the main conclusion from the theory is that then they will try to minimize losses. They will be less willing to take huge bets of huge risk, potential loss. But if they are in a loss frame, meaning that they believe that the current situation is not favorable to them, and with the passage of time, it will become even more unfavorable, then such persons may be more willing to take higher risks because they believe if they don't take risks now, the situation will only be worse in the future. So, of course, this is large degree informed speculation. It's quite obvious that we don't know. We are not sure what made President Putin to order full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But based on our understanding of strategic studies, international relations, we can have some suggestions. And I really believe that prospects theory can to a large degree explain it. Perhaps Russian government decided that if they don't do nothing, then they will lose Ukraine for good, using a common language. That Ukraine is growing closer and closer to NATO, and either they risk a full-scale invasion or they have to face reality that their strategic goals of controlling the political future of Ukraine may be unattainable with the passage of years. And definitely, President Putin believed in effectiveness of armed coercion. I think it is a justified hypothesis that perhaps the entire Russian military buildup since the autumn of 2021 was an ability to extract concessions from both Ukraine and NATO only by coercion, by threat of use of force. And Russian side was surprised by a strong response from NATO and the West, and put itself in a position where it had to act on its threats, or else it would lose face. Definitely, I think there was and not only on the Russian side, I think we in the West were ourselves surprised with the level of unified response and resolve of NATO countries in not caving in to Russian demands. And I think it would be probable that Russia was expecting West to be divided and weak and not to offer such a strong response. Definitely, they had a huge misperception of strength of Ukrainian resistance. They were not expecting such a strong performance by Ukrainian military. It could be argued, and several experts on Russia highlighted this at the beginning of the year, that there might have been at least a perception in the Russian government that the economic situation of Russia was favorable at that moment to try this heightened, to escalate the crisis and face confrontation because of high energy prices. Yes, Russia still has huge financial reserves. They were taking in record revenues from exports of oil and gas. So maybe that was a factor for Russian decision-making, thinking if we are to risk also economic confrontation with the West, this particular moment might be opportunate because we are in a relatively strong position economically. As you can see, maybe it was more a perception than reality, but it seemed reasonable at the time. And I think that's a very important insight from research of German researchers Gref and Kuhn published on War on the Rocks, looking at the history of Russian engagement in security system in Europe. So Russia definitely wanted to have Ukraine in its sphere of influence, but it turns out in early 2022 that the only tool they had to achieve this was brutal force, because Russia was unable to formulate a positive program, soft power, attractive regional institutions, economic cooperation that would convince Ukraine to be a close partner of Russia. Invasion, armed coercion were probably left as the only tools available. And definitely there was confidence on the Russian side in the strength of their military potential to achieve their objectives. So maybe we can try to speculate how this kind of calculation might be looking now, trying to guess for the Chinese leadership regarding Taiwan, looking at similar factors. And I use colors like the green, that it would be maybe similar to Russian position, red, very different from Russian situation, yellow, hard to determine, maybe somewhere in the middle, or we don't know the answer. So I think it could be argued that Beijing might be in the loss frame, looking at the Taiwan situation. And everything that was said also in the previous panel, that the CCP's belief that closer economic integration with Taiwan would make unification a more popular proposition among Taiwanese. But all the public opinion surveys and the results of presidential elections in 2016 and 2020 point in the completely different attitude of majority of Taiwanese society. Everything that was discussed by previous speakers about changes in US policy, in Japanese policy, that all may contribute to the perception in the Chinese government that if we wait in coming years, prospects for China realizing its strategic goals towards Taiwan might be worse rather than better. Now, does the Chinese government believe in the effectiveness of armed coercion to the degree that Russian government believe? It's really very difficult to tell, and I don't feel competent to answer this, really. Perception of West's weakness, well, now with a very strong response to Ukraine conflict, and with all the declaration from Japan, from Australia, also with Australian Defense Minister mentioning that he doesn't believe, he can't imagine that Australia would not support the United States in a Taiwan conflict. I think there can be little doubt in Chinese eyes that West, the Indo-Pacific powers would respond. How they perceive Taiwan's ability to resist, very difficult. Great discussion in this panel about lessons that Taiwan is taking from the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, there some time will be needed to absorb it into Taiwan's military forces. When it comes to favorable economic situation, where I think we can see that China is in a precarious moment when it comes to economy. Monday's data on the data published on Monday about the fall in exports, in retail sales in China, effects of lockdown, a crisis in the property sector with the debts for Evergrande. Definitely, this is a moment when Chinese economy needs stability and not turbulence from war. Whether China still have other effective tools to influence Taiwan, I think it's still very much an open question. It has many more positive tools to influence Taiwan economically, socially than Russia has to Ukraine. And confidence in one's strength, or maybe it's a little bold for me to market as not working that much for China. But there was a string of very interesting analysis done by, well, Western scholars like Denis Blasko, but based on Chinese, publicly available Chinese military writings, in which like the shortly conclusion was that it seems that Chinese military leadership might have serious doubts whether People's Liberation Army is really ready for a high technology local war, yeah, under conditions of informatization, as they call it. Plus, I would add two additional factors. When we think about Russia and China as, let's adopt this revisionist powers in the liberal international order, I would argue that the nature or the degree of their revisionism is a little different. So for example, Rudolph called China revisionist stakeholder. So I think shortly, main point from this for our situation we are discussing, China cares about its international reputation as a responsible great power way more than Russia does. So they see how much of a reputational damage Russia sustained. And we can say, well, President Putin doesn't seem to care about this. It can be argued the Russian leader may maybe relish his rogue image of a strong leader, of spoiler, troublemaker in the international system. Chinese leaders, I think not. Also, the tactics and strategy of Russia and China towards the United States, towards the international order, I think Russia has a way higher tolerance for risk in its actions than Chinese government is expressing. So what would be the main conclusions here? All of the factors I named in previous slides would point to a lower probability that China in the short term would try to do similar things as Russia did with Ukraine. However, one, there are important factors that increase the likelihood of escalation. Stakes of the conflict, how important this is for the CCP regime. It's really uncertain how many other tools, apart from armed coercion, effective tools China has towards Taiwan. It will be really difficult for United States to maintain also military deterrence posture on the level needed to deter Russia in Europe and China in Indo-Pacific at the same time. And we are unsure what kind of lessons China will draw eventually from Russia-Ukraine war. As Professor Hosoya mentioned earlier, maybe their lesson would be, we have to threaten the use of nuclear weapons from the start, and then United States will be afraid to interfere. And obviously what I presented, this is pretty much an analysis from Western strategic studies approach with our assumptions about rationality, about factors. But what is the calculus in Chongnanhai at this moment? It might be very different. So maybe, and this is more a question than or hypothesis than a conclusion, that maybe in the short term, the probability of Chinese use of force decreased due to these factors, but perhaps in the medium term, especially due to this loss frame, maybe it's actually gone higher. So that would be main conclusions. I hope I didn't overstep time too much, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think we had a really interesting panel with variety of perspective, some very theoretical, analytical, and I'm afraid we are running out of time. So what I would propose, maybe just one question from the audience. For the lucky ones that are in Poznań in person and can continue this discussion, or maybe in some way also the other speakers. So if you allow me to take maybe one question from the audience, especially for speakers that are online.
Can I ask? Hi.
Christiana Chen. Yes, please go ahead.
Christina, yes.
Christina, sorry.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm also from INDSR Taipei, and I have, I guess, a question for all the three speakers. But the first question's two parts. A question for both Professor Yuhua Chen and Evans. In your opinion, based on your assessment, under what conditions do you think China will engage in a war with Taiwan? Under what conditions and when? Because the third speaker talks about the time frame. And for the Professor Rafael, and my question is, you talked about perception, the misconception and misperception. I'm curious about your assessment about the United States, the Chinese perception. Sorry, the Chinese perception of the U.S. Does China perceive the U.S. as being more willing or less willing to intervene if China does engage in a war against Taiwan? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great questions. Thank you very much. And each speaker, please, under 1 minute answer.
So maybe we'll start with Professor Chen as the first
yes,
question
please.
was to him.
Right. Thank you very much, Christina. I would say it depends on what is your definition of war, right? If your definition of war is a full-scale and large-scale occupation of Taiwan Island, I would say the timing is not so hurry, probably after 20 or 40 years. different agencies provide different estimations, and we know in the long term there are so many factors may will come into play, like whether we will still have a CCP regime after 40 years, or do we does Xi Jinping will still be the general secretary of the CCP for a certain strike. So if we are talking about a full-scale war, I would say it's very hard to predict. But short term, but if you your definition for war is gray zone tactics, and I would say it can happen in any months, or maybe probably in the second half of this year, because CCP is going to hold another National Party Congress. And from the information we receive and we are seeing nowadays is she probably do not have too much chance to become a second term for its presidency and general secretary. So the thing is, if this kind of power struggle is going to happen, back to what I say in my presentation, this is much more likely that is the moment China more likely to use a force against others. But maybe this is not a full-scale war, just gray zone tactics. And we do see China keep trying different skills to coerce Taiwan. Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Evans?
Yes. Yeah, thanks for my colleague Christina's question. So to me, I think that's also difficult for us to assess the time. Well, to me, I think it's hard to predict when will the war or the military conflict take place in the Taiwan Strait. And that would be related to the first questions that, well, to me, I think the only one factor, if we try to simplify, the only one factor for Beijing is to decrease or to take it out the factor of U.S. involvement. And I think the best scenario for Beijing is to minimize or to cut off the U.S. involvement or assistance or participations in the Taiwan contingency. But we can imagine that it's quite difficult for Beijing to do that because, you know, the U.S. and Japan, these two powers are combined together. And well, over the past years, we also can see Taipei, Tokyo, and Washington, they work quite hard to strengthen, I call it Trinity, to strengthen the security of these three sides. So I think that would be also greatly, you know, challenging to Beijing. But I think the Beijing's strategy is to continue expanding, developing its military power to make sure it can conquer the U.S. involvement or assistance in the Taiwan contingency in the future. So I think that's Beijing's, you know, kind of endogenous, and I call it internal balancing strategy toward the situation in the future. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Rafa, would you like to add something for the closing?
I maybe focus on the second question that was addressed directly to me. Thank you for that. That's very important issue. So I think it can be easily argued that United States for the last couple of years is really making an effort, the US government, to make its informal security guarantees to Taiwan stronger with admitting military cooperation, with what US officials are saying. With this even, I think this unscripted remark by President Biden last year in a meeting with voters, asked whether US would defend Taiwan, and he said, yes, we have commitment to them. And then the State Department was trying to walk this back as not threatening the one China policy. So I think all these factors may really increase the perception in Beijing that they really would have to deal with US military response. But I think the big question here, is how they will interpret this. So would that be an argument? Because we would have to fight with America, we will not use force. because that would be too risky. That's one way. But the other way, if they interpret again this situation that America is going towards change in one China policy, and all the statements that were also presented in previous presentations in this conference about American statements, about Japanese statements, all these statements are obviously made to support Taiwanese security. But when looking from the mindset of Chinese Communist Party at those declarations, that the conclusion might be those countries are really going towards recognizing Taiwan as a separate country. This is very bad for our interests. We have to do something with it. Or maybe it will be too late. So which of these two interpretations China makes of these statements, that will be crucial, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a wonderful panel. Let's hope that the strong deterrence signals that United States and Japan and other countries are sending, and this really strong economic interdependence will, in the end, Thank you very much for the discussion. Really deep apologies for going so much behind time. And now we are going to have a short break. Could you please, I'm giving back the floor to Poznań. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are missing you.
Thank you, Beata.
Waiting you from Poznań.
Thank you. I'm waiting here in Japan for you to come.
Thank you.